So while I'm waiting for a couple of bits to arrive in the post for some bigger projects, one of the weird video requests I've had, especially after covering that rather weak GTX 745, is to look at the R7 240? I believe this is the R7. Yes, R7 240. Low-end display adapter from AMD probably about 14 years ago now? Maybe 13 years ago? Which we picked up in a mesh gaming PC, and it was just tucked behind, and we ended up using it for pretty much just that. But what I wanted to do today was just take a little look at it, see how far we can push it, see what it can actually do, and because of graphics card prices going through the roof, people are actually asking me if this is a good idea. These are also incredibly cheap on the international market, so it's a lot of viewers from the South Americas and some areas of Asia that are actually looking at buying these as an option, because apparently they are all over AliExpress, and they pretty much cost next to nothing anywhere you look. So this is like the global cheap graphics card. Just, it really is a display adapter. Even this Sapphire one does not fill me with confidence. But let's plug this in, see what it does, see if any modded drivers exist, and get it all set up. I think off the top of my head, this thing has 1GB of VRAM, and it is just DDR3. See, one of the main big reasons this sold was because you could buy them with 4GB of VRAM. It was always DDR3. There's no power plug required, there's nothing like that. You get HDMI, DVI, and VGA. It's a display adapter, it has display options. So this card itself was positioned as a cheaper alternative to the HD 7770 and by extension the R7 250 and the R7 350 and the R9 255 and the R7 450, all the rebrands. This is what it was positioned up against as the cheaper, lower cost alternative that gave you a degree of the performance, and honestly, not a huge deal of cost saving from what I remember of them back in the day. But because they worked on absolutely everything, you can find them absolutely everywhere. I'm scrolling through prices and people are asking nothing. £10, £10, £14. This one's an overclocked edition, which looks rather exciting for what is pretty terrible, to be honest. Someone's selling a gaming PC with a i5-9400F and this graphics card for 160 quid. That's a rip-off. You could buy this version in box for £59. Now this beast of a card is GCN1, which means we can use modified drivers. So we can run the 2050 kernel, just let it install. Given we are using modified drivers, it does show up as an R7 350. It is of course not an R7 350, it's an R7 240, but it's about as exciting as it looked. It is more of a display adapter than anything else, but seemingly no one else is making a video on this for 2026, so we're going to give the people what they want. So, in case anyone was wondering, this is running the Nemes modified drivers. I think they go by RDNID these days, but why don't we try and make this exciting? I'm going to try and guess how performance places itself. At the moment, this makes the GTX 745 look like a powerhouse. I don't know why AMD gave this the R7 name. I'm guessing it probably was to mislead people back in the day, because it did. The amount of these that sold with higher amounts of VRAM, and people were paying good money for them. Not so much good guy AMD, is it? This is not great. I mean, 1 gig of DDR3 is not exactly fantastic for this benchmark, but we'll get the results. We will get them. I don't think they're going to be very good. Pretty bad, to be honest. You got to remember this score is not going to be reminiscent of what it should actually be because it's reporting as an R7 350. Increase the power limit. I don't think it'll be able to do it. No, it can max out the core. Will it do 1050? This is actually quite a well-binned card. It just dies. Yeah, that was too much of an overclock. That was memory. Move the memory back down. We'll see what it does, and then we'll try running it in a game. I'm assuming it's just because the VRAM is so saturated that it's slow and it's not plentiful. I'm fairly sure from what I remember of our last time testing this, we ran into the same problems, which became even more so of an issue over on Linux, where the RAM management just wasn't as good as Windows, making this card pretty much a paperweight in Linux, when it really shouldn't be. Well, it's not exactly a great score, but it is an increase. I think we are just very VRAM limited because the graphics card is just... yeah, it's not great. Defaulted to 720p in a game of its era with Counter-Strike Go. It's running at sort of about 60ish FPS with a few frame drops in places. So I'm not exactly going to say it's the worst thing I've ever seen. I wasn't setting out today to redeem Nvidia's options of the era, but AMD actually sold this. But at the same time, they are very cheap right now. They are available all over the world. It is doing some gaming to an acceptable-ish degree. We'll run it through a full suite of benchmarks, and then at the end maybe we'll see if it's any good for retro gaming, because it seems fair to try and find a use for it. Yeah, but we'll get some more testing done, and we'll go from there. Sounds good enough to me. So what is the R7 240? Well, there was an OEM version which was much less egregious called the R5 240, which is really the name these all should have had, but yes, this is a real R7 graphics card made by AMD and sold to you the consumer market. It's based on GCN1 being the Oland Pro variant, and this version here has 1GB of GDDR3. You got to keep in mind most versions of these were sold at quite hefty prices, usually with 2 to 4GB of GDDR3 memory, making them much slower than virtually everything else on the market. We have a 64-bit memory bus, and you can get somewhat up-to-date drivers provided you don't mind using modified ones. You do get 320 cores, 20 TMUs, 8 ROPs, and a decent amount of DirectX 12 and Vulkan support. Power consumption is between 10 to 20 watts, and the price today for most of the world is between £5 to £50. The only reason I put the £50 mark there is because, yes, some people are still buying these brand new or in box, so that's based off the Amazon price and the listing we found earlier. Generally though, these are completely worthless, which is probably one of the reasons why people are asking me about them. It's not worth doing a comprehensive deep dive into the history of this card because it is, for most intents and purposes, a display adapter. Reviews at the time pretty much said, yes, it's a pretty decent display adapter, but you don't get many features with it, and for the price it sells at, either just spend the extra 25-30 quid and get a 750 Ti, or, you know, buy a HD 7750 or R7 250 from AMD. You get a lot more power and pretty much the same power requirements. But at the same time, there were some people that ended up with these in OEM systems in the form of the R5 240, or just the OEM straight up using the R7 240. So you could overclock them slightly okay, you got some passable performance in games of its era, and there was a little period on this channel, I think about 9 years ago, where we did look at this card and went, you know what, for the £5 it's selling for, it's not too bad. But that was back in 2017 when, really, it wasn't too bad. There's also another point of confusion to add, that AMD did release an SSD called the R7 240GB SSD, which really threw people off because, well, it's an SSD that used the same name as one of their graphics cards. So to summarise, on launch reviewers found that it overclocked pretty good, but that didn't make up for the rather detrimental performance you got out of it. Users at the time were a mixture of people finding it okay for the games they were playing, or downright despicable for the price they paid. A few years after this, they became a bit of a good budget offering, and have pretty much stayed at the same price ever since, which is one of the reasons why we haven't looked at them in 9 years. But given it was somewhat okay as a cheap offering 9 years ago, just exactly what does that mean in 2025? 2026 actually. Given we are taking this review somewhat seriously, there are some advantages to overclocking. Pretty much if you've got one of these, increase the power limit, increase the core clocks, and see how high you can go on the memory, because virtually all examples of this will be entirely memory bound. We went from 229 points to 273 points during 3D Mark's Time Spy, and to give you an idea of how this progresses across different benchmarks, we went from 5,143 in a DirectX 10 benchmark, down to 999 in a DirectX 11 benchmark, down to 319 in Time Spy's DirectX 12 benchmark. A modern DirectX 12 benchmark like Steel Nomad dropped us down further to 257, and I am completely amazed that Steel Nomad managed to complete, because this is possibly the worst score I've ever seen, with just 33 points. It's worth noting here that it crashed about 4 times trying to actually get into this benchmark. Going off our current comparison table, this is the worst graphics card we've actually tested, and it is around sort of the N150's integrated graphics, but generally even that performs better, and yes, it does in fact make Nvidia's pretty much scam offering of the GTX 745 look like a complete powerhouse. And you have to remember that AMD was actually selling this to consumers. I am fairly sure this is one of the weakest GCN1 graphics cards available. I'm sure there's a few oddballs out there that do perform worse than this, but I'm fairly sure any of the R5 or R7 cards listed beneath this were actually just terascale rebrands. So this really is GCN1 at its worst. Given the complete demand though that I've had for people requesting this graphics card to be tested, purely because it is cheap on the market and they're probably seeing it there and wondering, I wonder how good it actually is, and no one's actually testing it, we are going to be trying to throw this up into the modern benchmark suite. Yes, I have got a few retro tests planned later, but for all intents and purposes, we are going to take this graphics card and throw it up into all of our usual benchmarks. Now, the latest and greatest Unreal Engine 5 titles like Oblivion Remastered, they aren't even going to begin to launch on here, not necessarily because of the lack of VRAM and power, but just because DirectX 12 on this card, despite being good, does top out at a certain level. So there's lots we have been able to run, but there's also been lots of tweaking required to actually get this through the benchmarks. And given that it was performing okay back in 2017, you do have to remember that was nearly a decade ago now, and a lot of those games have got updated, even if they are still very popular and being played. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this R7 240, probably one of the worst variants out there, and we're going to see just what can it do. So it's time to take what is more or less a glorified display adapter that AMD ripped people off on, and find out how it's performing in 2026 in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition. That's right, this is the latest release of GTA 5, and how is it holding up on the R7 240? Well, we did manage to get it slightly playable with low settings and a 540p resolution, which did mean that most of the effects were turned off. I think this is the first time we've ever ran this game with settings this low. We returned 33 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 26 FPS, which was controllable even under heavy action, so yes, the card can still do this. I'd imagine the overclock is doing quite a lot of the heavy lifting to keep us above 30 FPS though, but virtually all of these cards do overclock. Over in the world of online, our average went down by 2 frames per second with the same settings, and our 1% lows stayed the exact same. Honestly, there was very little difference between them. So GTA 5 Enhanced Edition works perfectly fine whether you're in single player or multiplayer, and you're going to be looking in around a 30 FPS experience in a sub-high definition resolution. To give people a reminder, the R7 240 was probably one of the lesser AMD cards that the original version of GTA 5 was probably designed for, given that, as bad as it is, it did sell. Whether that's down to the fact it does serve some degree of purpose, and whether that's down to AMD's pretty terrible marketing, well, it's up to you to decide. But at the end of the day, back in the day on this game, it did achieve normal settings with soft shadows in a 720p resolution, and did return a 44 FPS experience. We did see 1% lows down to 34 FPS, but honestly, this card could run GTA 5 back in the day in a 720p resolution, and that is one of the reasons why people bought it. If you just wanted something that could play GTA, people did buy cards like this. Over in the world of online, which is a lot more intensive than it used to be, we saw our average go down to 37 FPS, with 1% lows down to 32 FPS. This was in a fully packed lobby, so I'm actually surprised it managed to do this well, with just 1GB of GDDR3 memory on board. So yeah, a bit of a weird one, but it gives you an idea of how this card used to run back in the day. 720p and a couple of effects turned on for a slightly better than 30 FPS experience. One of the few reasons back in the day people recommended this card was for esports titles. So one of the more popular ones of them out there, Counter-Strike 2, how is it holding up? Well, with low settings and a 720x400 resolution, that's right, we're talking resolutions that are on par with the original Xbox, we did return a rather decent 90 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 61 FPS. And you could replicate this in real-world gameplay and matches, provided you were playing one of the simpler maps out there. The problem is, yes, GDDR3 isn't good, but having just 1GB of it is downright terrible, because when you try and go into slightly better maps than this, well, you're looking at a frame rate that's anywhere sort of between 40 to 60 FPS, pretty much cutting your frame rate in half over what it is in something like Dust 2. So yeah, Counter-Strike is not exactly a particularly fantastic experience, but it is something you can still just about get away with on a card like this. The resolution's terrible, the visibility isn't great, but you can still make out what you're doing and control it in simpler scenarios. I'm not praising the card, I'm just saying it was controllable. For a little bit of a throwback again just to how the card used to perform, and also somewhat relevant given that CSGO is back and actually has a substantial player base that I wasn't expecting over when we covered it, last week? But still, with the competitive settings in a 720p resolution when actually playing a competitive game, we actually saw 88 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 60 FPS, which pretty much stayed the exact same regardless of the map we were actually playing on. So CSGO goes to show that yes, back in the day, this was a semi-passable esports card. Yes, you have to ignore that there were far better options back in the day, but it could just about get away with it. So at the end of the day, yes, CSGO is a substantially better experience than Counter-Strike 2 was, but then again, it is a much less VRAM intensive game, it really doesn't require the bandwidth that Counter-Strike 2 does, and you do actually get, well, I suppose better looking visuals because you can tell what's going on a little bit easier. Now, BeamNG, people did play the earlier iterations of this game on cards like this. Why? Because, well, they were one of the cheapest options to show up in Amazon, and usually offered you more than the 1GB we've got here. You've got to remember this Sapphire variant seems to be an anomaly of a card that comes with, well, 1GB of VRAM, which is all the card really needs. But with the lowest settings in the jungle map in a 720p resolution, I'm going to call this the best experience possible, because yes, you could go down to 480p, you'd get maybe 3 or 4 FPS more, but you could hardly tell what was going on. So yes, this is probably the best you'll get it to be. 26 FPS, 1% lows down to 22 FPS. If you look at those frame times up in the top left though, you'll see that this is a controllable experience. I'm sure later on in the video we'll return to an older version of this game just to see how it performs, but as it stands with the latest release, 720p, lowest settings and one of the more intensive maps, and you're seeing something between 25 to 30 FPS most of the time. Simpler maps and scenarios will work better, but that isn't the point of this benchmark. There wasn't much of a chance for Arc Raiders to work on this card, but I do believe this may be the worst card that this game will actually launch on. I'm sure there's probably a couple of rare other exceptions that are probably GCN rebrandians other than this, but this is probably the main notable card that you can get it to run on. With low settings in 240p, utilising FSR to upscale this to about 768p, we return to 21 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 15 FPS. This is what I would call unplayable, because, let's be honest, that frame rate isn't great. The optimizations in this game do ensure that the frame times were remarkably good, but I was doing things like reducing our field of view just to eke back an extra frame per second. So Arc Raiders, pretty much completely unplayable. It is controllable. I don't think anyone out there is using the R7 240 to play it in the modern day, but you never know. So yes, it will launch. Whether or not you call this blurry, hazy experience a game rather than a hallucination is up to you. This one was a tiny bit of a surprise, as Fortnite did run surprisingly well with its own auto-detected settings. I'm guessing some people out there are still using this low-end display adapter for running modern games, because you do have modern API support. Not that you'll be using it here, because with the limited DDR3 based VRAM, DirectX 11.1 is a lot less bandwidth hungry, but did return us some somewhat decent frame rates. With low settings and a 720p resolution and the aforementioned DirectX 11.1 API, we returned 49 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 37 FPS. And this was taken during built-up areas when there was lots of people there and attacking things and lots of stuff was going on. Honestly, I was expecting to have to lower the resolution further than this, probably around 540p, but no, Fortnite still runs surprisingly well on the garbage that is the R7 240, and this is only the really bad 1GB version. In direct competition with Fortnite though, we do have PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, which with very low settings and DirectX 11.1 once again, in a 540p resolution, we did eke out a somewhat playable 36 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 21 FPS. Now it is worth saying here that PUBG is awfully VRAM heavy for what it actually is, so with 1GB of GDDR3 memory, it is going to struggle. Dropping resolutions much lower than this made very little to no difference given the base requirements of this game and what it does actually need to run, but eventually after the game had stabilised, it would be anywhere from sort of around 25 to 35 FPS or around 40 FPS when not much was going on. Not exactly a phenomenal experience, but PUBG, if anything, it's better today than it was back in the day, given this game has received optimizations that do apparently benefit the R7 240. Next up was Rust, and this game has got a lot more intensive than it used to be. I actually went back and found a video I made on a very similar graphics card to this, well, the OEM variant, which is the R5 240, really what this card should have always been sold as, and it used to run it in 720p with a better frame rate than this. But in the modern day, after the updates this game has received, it does now mean that with the very lowest settings all manually selected and a 240p resolution is about the only way to eke out a playable frame rate now on the R7 240, and I dread to think what this would be like without an overclock in place. We saw 28 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 21 FPS, but frame times were stable enough that you could control things. Given that this used to run a lot better though, well, the R7 240 was pretty much obsolete on arrival, and let's be honest, it is clearly struggling quite a lot more today. This one, I don't know really what I was expecting. Maybe it's because we tested the GTX 745 and nearly eked out a playable frame rate on it, and given this is somewhat of a similar AMD card, given that OEMs did love this thing, I thought maybe there's a chance. Well, there's no chance at all this is going to run, as with the lowest settings in a 768p resolution and FSR set to performance mode, so this is running somewhere between 240p and 360p, we saw 14 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 10 FPS. Really, we are just completely memory bandwidth bottlenecked, I'm gonna say here, because look how smooth those frame times are, because the game is just trying to load in everything as quick as the card can render it. So no, Cyberpunk is not playable. I doubt this is a surprise to absolutely anyone, and the FSR in here just looks so bad in this example that I don't really know what else to say. Now this one is an interesting one, as Fallout 4's anniversary update has had some odd implications for these older graphics cards, especially the ones that 1. Don't have much VRAM and 2. Often have very slow VRAM. We were able to run the game with low settings in 720p provided it didn't crash, as the first 3 times launching the game it just wouldn't actually launch. But still, when you weren't actually in the towns and cities and doing combat, you would see anywhere from sort of 30 to 40 FPS, but during the benchmark section that we usually do, we were hovering in and around the 30 FPS mark, usually dropping slightly beneath this given the amount of NPCs and enemies that were following us. So Fallout 4, playable in a pinch, but the anniversary update has certainly been detrimental to the performance on these. I can't even call it a graphics card because this is just a display adapter. It's always worth including Bannerlord even on these lower end cards because it always seems to know what to do. It defaulted to very low settings, which don't look particularly great here, but it did at least retain a 720p resolution. And to be fair, I fully respected choosing these settings because it meant we saw 40 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 28 FPS. Given this is so reminiscent of the late game though, I did drop into a smaller size battle, and the game pretty much runs anywhere between 50 to 60 FPS for a lot of the early to mid game. So Mount & Blade Bannerlord, I have no idea if the devs factored this in when they were making this game, I really doubt they did, but it is such a fantastically optimized title that yes, it does look pretty hideous with these settings, but it runs very smoothly and in a high definition resolution on something that is, well, complete and utter garbage from AMD. I am including The Sims 4 here for a couple of reasons. One, because it does show that the R7 240 can still manage a lot of those simpler 3D titles. I mean, really, The Sims 4 is probably what this would have been playing back in the day, but it goes to show that it can still run it fine even after years of updates. The Sims 4, for virtually every single one of the flaws it does possess, is actually a spectacularly well optimized title. I mean, it's not exactly amazing, but given all the faults this game has, has, but it does seem to run well on just about everything I've ever tested. So for lots of people that would have been buying a graphics card to whack in their system to play something like this, well, it gives you an idea why it sold. They would have plugged this in their PC after spending 50-60 quid on it on Amazon. They didn't care what else they were getting, they just saw that people said, oh, it can play The Sims 4, and you know what? They plugged it in their PC and it is still running The Sims 4 to this day. That is sort of the audience this was always intended for. There are going to be some people saying, oh, I bought this to use it for Source games, and you know what, fair play, the R7 240 does in fact deal with Source games incredibly well. Even when they're pushed to their most intensive, with Black Mesa here running with low settings in its Zen level, and utilising DirectX 9 in a 720p resolution. Keep in mind this is about as intensive as this game can get, it does look absolutely gorgeous for it, and we returned 44 FPS, with 1% lows down to 35 FPS. So whether or not you want to say this is due to the Source engine, or whether or not you want to say it's to do with how well the R7 240 deals with Source games, yes, this card was always good for things like Half-Life 2, Gary's Mod, Counter-Strike, as we've already covered. Even when it's pushed to these intensive levels, you do still see a playable frame rate and a decent resolution. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? Well, actually, yes it can. This one did surprise me. Crysis Remastered, with its low settings, is very well optimised. Once again though, it does completely cry out for memory bandwidth, and actually a decent chunk of VRAM while it's at it. So we had to use an 800x600 resolution to bring us under the 1GB threshold, otherwise it was, well, completely unplayable during actual intensive scenes. But with these settings, the game didn't look too bad, and we did at least return 31 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 23 FPS. So Crysis Remastered, is it the game that's optimised, or is it the R7 240 is just actually a gaming beast that can handle the new version of Crysis absolutely fine? I think I'm just going to say that this version of Crysis is well optimised. But honestly, it's pretty good seeing the R7 240 actually deliver visuals like this. I wasn't expecting it, and it's nice to finish the benchmarks on a little bit of a high. Overall performance is quite tricky to place on a card like this. As I've said, there's a lot of new titles that won't even launch on it, but really it doesn't have the power to play them anyway. A good way of knowing this is, well, Cyberpunk 2077. We've had good experiences just about managing to eke out a low settings and 30 FPS experience, even on cards as low end as the GTX 745. But here, even with the lowest settings, we are so memory limited that 14 FPS was the best we were able to do in something that resembled an upscaled 240p experience. Still, when it comes to a lot of the popular titles like GTA 5, whether it be the Enhanced Edition or the Legacy version, yes, it is struggling with the newer versions, but it is still running them. Counter-Strike 2 does run on it, provided you don't mind a standard definition resolution, and as long as Counter-Strike Go remains back on Steam, well, that's still running absolutely a-okay. It's worth noting, though, that this is an interesting point. We were able to run this in 1080p with the older video we did on this, so this Legacy version that is quite a bit newer than that, well, you are looking at 720p to keep the game running at its finest. BeamNG was playable, provided you didn't mind simpler maps, and honestly, I'm amazed Arc Raiders didn't just straight up crash. Not that I'd really call it playable, but it was controllable. Fortnite was a surprise because it was actually surprisingly playable, and at the end of the day, it could still run Crysis, so it has still sort of got that going for it. The performance is pretty appalling, but for a card that pretty much anyone in the world can whack in a system and play a lot of popular titles on, provided they don't mind sub 720p resolutions, it's not the worst I've ever seen. To be fair though, it does entirely redeem Nvidia's GTX 745, because I went into that video very pessimistically and rather annoyed at its existence, until I remembered that, hang on a second, AMD was objectively doing something even worse than this, and was selling it direct to consumer, in the form of this very graphics card. This card is very lacking in features though. I mean, you do get all the AMD driver side features, but you don't get anything like AMD VCE, you don't get anything like that really. If it had stuff like that, then I suppose I'd say, you know what, maybe it does serve a degree of purpose, but given this card retailed for the same price as its higher end offerings that did include a video encoder, there's nothing like that on here that will work, you just simply don't get it. I suppose thermals are a huge advantage. Even reviewers of the time noticed that even if you really overclock these and really shove in a ton of voltage, they don't get hot. It is a very power efficient graphics card that generally does hover in and around the 10 to 20 watt mark, and because of this, even with this minuscule cooler that Sapphire has bolted on here, running Furmark at its maximum resolution, we saw it top out at around 58 degrees. I'm not even going to bother throwing up a graph because all you need to know is desktop usage 30 degrees, gaming 40 to 50, max temperature just under 60 degrees, and that was all taken with an overclock. There's no point doing any real data analysis into this because the two things it does have going for it is power efficiency and thermals. Yes, you can make pretty much any of the competing cards equally as power efficient as we have seen, but it is something this card can do, so I'll give it credit there. But one thing I did want to do was talk about those AMD features you do get and see if maybe it has any use in older games or retro games or easier to run games in a bit of a segment where we try and think, you know what, if this is your only option, you never know if this is the card that someone has got on their market and this is just all they can afford to buy, is there anything maybe that it stands out for? So overall performance on the R7 240 was lacking, to say the least, to be honest, but you do get the AMD driver sets, so it is worth us going through here and seeing if maybe there's some use for this in modern titles. I believe there are Windows XP drivers, at the very least there's Windows Vista and Windows 7 drivers, meaning that for a few older titles, maybe it's something that's worth considering with some enhancements turned on. As you can see, if you go to recording, there's nothing here that you can actually do with it. It's got the live stream options, but that's just going to use your processor, so you pretty much can't do anything in there. We do actually get a degree of enhancements. So for example, we actually get the ability to frame rate target control, but we can turn on things like anti-aliasing, we can force 8 times EQ, nah, we'll just leave it on normal, 8 times EQ anti-aliasing, anisotropic filtering, force that on 16 times, enable high quality filtering, and I think what we're going to do is just run some more classic benchmarks just to see what it can do. One thing I did want to start with though was running an older version of BeamNG. This is an old version of BeamNG though, so what settings are we defaulted to? I'd imagine we could default to, say, put it on normal settings. Okay, maybe this is a little bit too intensive because this is running pretty badly, to be honest. Right, let's drop it back to 720p. 1080p is probably a little bit too optimistic. So if we start with BeamNG, at least the old DirectX 9 version of it, and performance is around the same as what it was with slightly better visuals. I mean, we're still getting sort of low 20-ish FPS. I'd imagine this is before any degree of optimizations took place, which is likely why it's not exactly running spectacularly, but the VRAM usage is much lower, using 600 megabytes to produce these types of visuals. You can go back and download this old version in case anyone wants to give it a go. Honestly, with the higher settings, I'd be willing to say it's probably one of the better looking DirectX 9 games out there. You can manage a slightly better frame rate. It's not going to be spectacularly better, but it does mean you get slightly better visuals than the complete lowest blobby mess of the latest version. But come on, let's be honest, this game is pretty well optimized even in its current state, and we're going back to a very early access version to be able to get this performance, so we are missing out on a lot of features. And now we are entering one of the more simple areas. We are up to nearly 30 FPS. So BeamNG does run better on an older version, which is probably more reminiscent of what people would have been playing on this card back in the day. Don't exactly expect miracles from it. What should we try next? I've got a couple of other ideas of what we should try. Now this one I'm a little bit curious for because we're running this in 1600 by 900 with Halo Combat Evolved. I've got the EQ AA enabled, I've got the texture filtering enabled. I do believe the AMD drivers do support retro games better than the latest Nvidia ones do, but then again, they are also older drivers, so they should do. I'm going to say though, visuals so far look absolutely fantastic. I'm just going to make sure there's no graphical issues or bugs or rendering problems. Doesn't appear to be, and we are getting hundreds of FPS. So yeah, for these older games, you can pretty much enable all of the driver side enhancements and it'll run absolutely fine. The bugs that we are getting here, like the bullets not showing up, is a common Windows 11 problem, but let's be honest, if you were playing stuff like this, you'd probably be going back to, say, Windows XP, maybe Windows Vista, and you'd probably have less problems. bit of retro gaming from the turn of the 2000s, and you're looking at a really solid experience without any real degree of slowdown, or probably any real graphical problems provided you aren't running Windows 11. Really, I should set up a separate computer to do these tests with, but that's coming later on in the year when we actually build a proper Windows 7 test system. I've picked one up, but I haven't made the video on it yet. Although I will say it is seeing 100% utilization even on our little R7 240, but it is certainly utilizing the card spectacularly well here. I've left Project Zomboid here running with, well, admittedly its default settings, which seem to be low everything in 720p. A lot of the lower settings in this are actually just the legacy options from back in the day, so I'm just going to leave it running at these settings. And to be fair, it's probably a good idea leaving it running at these settings because utilization is spiking up to around 100% when we sort of look further away, and probably when we zoom out, yeah, it sort of hovers around 60% and then shoots up to 80% when it needs to. Honestly, we're using nearly a full gigabyte of our DDR3. There's always one fella in the comments, I'm sorry I cannot remember most people's names from the comments unless they're in front of me, who really appreciates seeing Project Zomboid being tested. So this one goes out to you because it does run perfectly fine on this little R7 240, even when you're in built-up areas and there's zombies and bits going on. Zooming in does bring our utilization down as well and keeps the frame rate smoother, which is something nice to see, but let's move on to something a little bit more intensive, shall we? Well, we have got Metal Gear Solid 5 here because, let's be honest, it is one of the most beautifully optimized games, probably, of all time. I mean, there are, of course, exceptions. There's lots of beautifully optimized games, but given the visuals this is producing on an R7 240, we did see this already in the Mesh PC video where, to be fair, even running with a Core 2 quad, our bottleneck was pretty much the R7, and this goes to show it because our frame rate is pretty much exactly the same. It's hovering between around sort of 25 to 35 FPS. I'm sure I will throw up the exact figures down in the bottom left. There's not a great deal too much else to say here because, I mean, let's be honest, it looks fantastic, it runs fantastic, it's got 720p resolution going on, so at least we are seeing high definition visuals. Yeah, this runs perfectly fine on the R7 240. Now for the next game, I did want to try turning on super sampling. So what I wanted to do was turn on super sampling and then turn it up to 4 times. Should we try 8 times super sampling? And then what I'm going to do is try launching, say, Half-Life 1. Now this is the Steam release of Half-Life 1. Of course, I'm sure the original version would run a lot better. So this is with all the texture filtering turned on. This is with all the other bits and pieces turned on. Yeah, it's running about as well as I would expect. Worth noting though, we are seeing 100% GPU usage from this. I'd be curious to compare this to the original retail release rather than the Steam version, because then we can use D3D rather than OpenGL. As a retro graphics card with these features, well, the R7 240 does achieve some really nice visuals and can play a lot of these games super sampled up to incredibly high resolutions. I'm going to give the R7 240 credit here. A lot of these features do scale well going forward, especially into titles like this, where you just get really great visuals. You can still use the 4:3 resolution, and I'm sure if you were running this on Windows 7 or Windows XP, it would look even better. Probably because you're running a native experience and you're running the original version of the game, but still. I just want to see how this section here does, because we were messing around with super sampling on a GeForce 4 Ti last week. That was a fun video, and this section went down to around 35 FPS. Whereas here we are seeing 77 FPS with, of course, an even higher resolution in a newer version of the game. So I'm going to call that a success there. Retro gaming pretty much works absolutely fine on the R7 240 and is one of the more optimistic takes I can make about it. There's better options out there, but you know what? It's delivering some pretty clear visuals for a graphics card you can pick up for next to nothing. So there we have it, AMD's R7 240. And I suppose this video is sort of a multi-purpose video. For those people that are asking me in less fortunate markets whether or not it's a good option, well, there are certainly better options out there, but I suppose if this is your only choice, at least you know what the performance is like. For those looking at it for retro gaming, honestly, not a bad card. And for those of you wondering just how it's performing, well, not very well. I do believe I owe an apology to Nvidia for their GTX 745 that we reviewed a couple of weeks ago, because honestly, Well, that was substantially better than this is. Neither of them are great cards, but Nvidia never tried to sell that one to the public. The one thing this does have going for it is where people are trying to scalp the GTX 745, probably because that GTX name and people not realizing they can put a better graphics card in their system, these are very, very cheap. So you can pick them up on CEX, over on eBay, on AliExpress, local markets and other places like that. These are still a £5 graphics card no matter where you're looking. The same as it was last time we looked at it. But a lot has changed in nearly a decade, and even though a lot of the games we tested last time are still popular today, they are more intensive. So yes, it can still do a little bit of gaming if you're in a pinch. Should AMD have been selling this card as an R7? Probably not. It really did deserve the R5 or maybe even the R3 name, but then again, it was a card designed to confuse consumers into buying this over the slightly better versions because they could whack on 4 gigs of VRAM that I really doubt would have helped because honestly, yes, the memory was a limit here, but it was the speed of it more than the quantity of it because, let's be honest, 4 gigabytes on a card like this, it's not really going to do anything. Anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed this video. I hope those of you that were asking have found this informative, and I hope those of you that enjoy laughing at low-end display adapters have had a good chuckle at the misery of the R7 240. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. Just as I was recording this bit of voiceover though, my Intel Haswell Xeon processor that I was waiting for, just to give you a little hint of what's coming, has just arrived through the post. So do expect a bigger video towards the end of the week. But thank you all very much for watching, and good night.